Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
In the last few videos, we've been talking about the control of reactions, and there's different ways you can control reactions. You could use your inner speech, or you could use visualization. So, can you talk a little bit about how to use visualization? What are the different ways to use it? And is visualizing useful in the work?
Yes. Um, the control of reaction is part of our inheritance. We are a reasonable creature. We are using language, and we do many things with language. And we, in fact, do not really see the extent on which language can be useful in order to, well, control our reaction or change your reaction, which is more or less the same thing. Alexander had an idea, and he practiced exploring with this idea, giving himself orders and seeing where he could go with orders. So nowadays, we work with the Alexander technique in the way we want, and there are so many ways to work with that it's quite interesting from time to time to come back to the source, to come back to Alexander himself, and to observe his theory, and observe also, which is very funny, his way of presenting his theory. So visualization has something to do, you must understand, with position. And we discussed already that Alexander said that there is no such thing as a correct standing, or not such thing as correct standing position, but correct coordination. So it's interesting to see what he says at the end of his life regarding visualization. And so it's quite a long chapter, but I'm going to make it short. He's talking about the idea that it's helpful to know and to be able to acquire the right standing position, for example. Uh, and he said that the first thing is to consider the facts, which is quite funny because he's already said in another book, this is in Constructive Conscious Control, he said last time, if you remember, that there is no such thing as a correct standing position. But now he's talking about how useful it could be to acquire the right position. So is very curiously trying to make us reason about this. He's not just saying this is the way or this is not the way. You should not try to get the right position. Then suddenly it's helpful to know and to acquire the right position. Clearly, these ideas are antagonistic, and he's clearly playing with us. He's not. He's not asking us to. Is like drink is knowledge. He's asking us to reason about it. And so he says that to pass from wrong to right condition of posture and functioning, it means change. So then there is a right and a wrong way of standing, of sitting. Of course, there is. There are many teachers nowadays that say, no, no, there is no such thing as a wrong, as a correct position. Well, Alexander is clearly saying exactly the opposite. And he says that it has to be acquired by a gradual process of change. So that this goes against the idea that in a few minutes, somebody with skilled hands could make such a tremendous change that the person would suddenly be in the right condition of functioning. This is absurd. Yes, Alexander really belabored the idea that there are many, many obstacles in our way to change. And so it means that change has to be made in time. From that, I suddenly realized that the change is not to be passed from the teacher to the pupil. The teacher can give directions, he can give some ideas, can have the pupil start to play with ordering his movements, but change has to take time. And he says, Alexander say, it must be a gradual process of change from day to day, so that the effect of the readjustment of the bony structure, the sense of equilibrium, and the interference with the habitual sense of equilibrium. That is, the pupil has a certain feeling that tell him that he is balanced, that is upright and safe. Well, during the first lesson, the pupil will have to, in fact, challenge this habitual sense of equilibrium. What he feels as being poised, as being stable, is totally adapted to his faulty habits and to his faulty sensory appreciation that is telling him, now I'm falling. Well, what if we can demonstrate to the pupil that when he feels he's falling, in fact, he's not? Well, then it's absolutely clear that the pupil will have to work with his own habitual sense of equilibrium. It's not just because you have shown a pupil that very often when he's not out of balance, he feels out of balance, that the pupil can do something about it. It's only through experiments. Alexander did many experiments. So as a teacher, my job is to just provide experiments, provide ways for the pupil to start embarking into this great, path of experiments, path of discoveries. I am not here to make the pupil discover everything. It's not the point. So common sense dictates that change, such as the one we want, change in equilibrium, change in manner of functioning, change in manner of coordinating movements, cannot be made in a single lesson or in a month of lessons. That's Alexander speaking. And I totally agree with that. Yes, it's necessary for the pupil to be given the tools with which he will experiment with his own sense of balance. So this is a start, and it's a start where the pupil is going to discover conscious guidance and control. Very often, the modern Alexander technique is not defined as conscious guidance and control, but it was what Alexander wanted to call his technique. Along his 4 books, time and again, he comes back to this idea of conscious guidance and control. And the idea is so little developed in the Alexander technique world that it's sometimes necessary for me to completely change the scenery and have people understand that, well, first of all, it exists, but second, it is also studied. And it's studied under a different name. So I want to introduce, before we talk about pro or contra visualization, I want to develop what visualization is part of nowadays. How can we consider it in a detached way, so that it's not associated with the Alexander technique, so that we can have contact with it that is not in fact taken into a mass of conception that we may or not agree with. So, in modern terms, conscious control exists. Conscious control is studied, but it's studied under a different name. It's studied under the very broad name of executive functions. And it's good to start with this and have a definition. So I've taken a definition from a couple of scientists that I appreciate. It's Carlson and Smythe. And so what they are saying is that executive functions or executive function refers to domain general cognitive processes enlisted in the service of conscious control over thought, action, and emotion. component of executive function include working memory, inhibitory control, shifting flexibility, goal-directed planning, and error detection correction. It is known that children, before they start learning speech, have very little capability of conscious control over their thought, over their action, or over their emotions. But soon they start to learn language, and they start to see that they are ordered around by their elders, by their parents, and quickly they will start to understand the tool of language and start to in fact direct commands at their parents. They are starting to use language in order to command others, and very soon this will open their mind to the idea that if they can command someone else, well, they can command themselves. And so it happens. There are many different area of studies. One is when there is a failure in executive function, what happens? There are children that have difficulty mastering language or difficulty mastering the use of language in order to create orders, valid orders, or because they can't remember the orders, or they can't visualize. We will come back to that. Or they have difficulty with inhibitory control, which is more or less obeying an order that you give yourself. So you say, I am not going to move my hand, and seconds later you're moving your hand, which shows that you've been able to give the order, but you have not been able to translate the order into the refusal that was stipulated in the orders. So when we study children with defective executive functions, it gives us an idea into what it is we use as human beings when we just get on with normal life. Executive functions are present in every single moment of our lives. It's and now where Alexander is very interesting is that through him I discovered that of course during our younger years, and especially school years, we learn a lot about this conscious guidance and control. But Alexander pointed to the fact that this learning is never ended. And in our habitual life, we stop too early to learn about conscious control over our thoughts, over actions, and over emotions. And Alexander started with this idea that it would be very interesting to somehow start again on a different basis. By that, I mean that when you're a child, there are no lessons of executive function. Even when you enter primary school, small school, you are expected to behave. Of course, you're given some tuition into how to control your actions, into how to control your emotions, and how you can organize your activity. But it is not a very reason program. With Alexander, we change the level. Then suddenly we start to encounter what we call coordinated actions, complex coordinated actions with a very definite result to be obtained. And so we enter into a much more detailed and precise, accurate learning curve of how to implement conscious control in our activity. So it's all present there. When we say that component of the executive function includes, for example, working memory, you must understand that people have been working on this, and then they have discovered that a working memory is can be presented as two parts. Of course, there is a speech memory. You must remember what you want to do. You must remember how you want to do it, and most of the time this is remembered as speech. So there is, of course, a memory for speech, but there is another memory that is very interesting to us. It's what we call spatial memory or visual spatial memory, the capacity to represent not only words following one after the other in lines. Yes, and even when we remember, there is a sequence that is instilled by the very fact that we use language and words are going one after the other. But with visual spatial memory, you can imagine, in fact, placing different subjects in your mental representation, which is a visual representation, and thinking, okay, there is what we are discussing, which is visualization, but this is in fact encompassed into a wider field that is conscious control, and that conscious control, we can name it executive function. This is how I plan these speeches, in fact. Yes, it's not only using verbal memory, but using another kind of memory. So that other kind of memory, of course, has to do with visualization. But you will find that Alexander also speaks about visualization. It's quite interesting. And at first, when he proposes his ideas, uh, the impression is that he's dead against visualization. And you will hear very often teachers saying that we do not, in the Alexander technique, we do not visualize. So do we or do we not visualize? If it's included in conscious control, not visualizing will be a lack somewhere. So it's necessary to broach that subject and start to talk about it. So it's very important to speak about visualization also for another reason, is that very often my students or pupils that come to the Alexander technique, they come because of this idea that there will be a benefit in terms of position, that there will be a benefit in terms of physical functioning. I agree with them, of course. It's impossible to deny. But to think that the Alexander technique is centered on this aspect is, to my view, is not the correct perspective. There is a much better perspective is to start with the idea that the Alexander technique, or the initial Alexander technique as I teach it, has more to do with the development of conscious guidance and control, of executive functions, than with a secondary benefit or tertiary benefit that would be, well, if you are more able to, of course, exert conscious control over coordinated actions, you're going to be able to stand, to sit, to breathe, of course, in a more functional way. This is obvious. Yes, but let's not confuse the means and the result. The means is, how are we going to use orders? How are we going to use our mind, in fact, in order to obtain the change in posture or in position or in functioning that that is possible? Yes, to explore. So now we had a lesson last time with Kevin, and I started, without telling you that I was doing so, I started asking Kevin to use visualization. But it's not the kind of visualization that you're used to. So it's maybe necessary to, in fact, go back to the beginning where Alexander is talking about this idea of how he is or not to use visualization. This is The Universal Constant in Living. It's the fourth book. It's the last book Alexander wrote. And it's quite interesting to see that what he's got to say first and what he's got to say at the end of his working career. It is almost certain too that the same pupil we have been discussing in the previous part of the chapter, this pupil that wanted to acquire the right position. So right position in as defined in the mind of the new pupil. It is almost certain too that the same pupil will be convinced that the teacher can and should tell him what is the right standing, sitting, or other position, and enable him to acquire and maintain this position in each instance. And that to be a good pupil, he must concentrate on trying to be right and must visualize how he is to carry out his teacher's instructions in the course of his work. It can be demonstrated that the attempt to concentrate in such cases resolves itself into a condition of increased muscle tension and self-hypnotism, and therefore tends to lessen rather than increase the chance of success. This can also be said of the beginner's attempt to visualize what is to be done and how to do it. Seeing that in taking impressions, it depends for guidance and judgment upon the same feeling that he has always depended upon in the past and which had led him into the wrongness he wishes to change into tightness. So, this is how Alexander presents visualization. It's associated with an activity of mind that he calls concentrating. So concentrating has a lot to do, of course, over the this conscious control of thinking, conscious control of the mind. And he says that when the pupil visualize in this way, he will concentrate and increase the muscle tension and self-hypnotism. Just a word about self-hypnotism. When Alexander is talking about self-hypnotism, you must remember the habitual sense of equilibrium. When I first explain to a pupil that she's not falling, but that she's lifting the toes because she feels she's falling, let me tell you that she's not going to take that lightly or kindly. If she feels that she's falling, it is that she's falling, and she knows her body. She knows it better than me. So how can I say that in fact she's reacting to something that is not true? Of course, it is true for her, but when we use well, a simple objective analysis of her actions, and most of the time I ask the pupil to perform in front of a vertical reference surface, a wall, and I can show the person that at the moment when she started to lift the toes of the floor, which was associated with a perception of falling, habitual sense of equilibrium was threatened, it was obvious that she was leaning in the opposite direction of the direction she thought she was falling into. So self-hypnotism is something for Alexander that relates to sensory appreciation. Is you are in a condition of self-hypnotism when you start to believe what you feel over the reality of the mechanics of the field in which you are immersed. So self-hypnotism is something that is not at all uncommon We all, in fact, believe more or less what we feel. And it's only when we have a video recording that we start to wonder and to discover that, wow, this is very, very common. And conscious control over the self should include also conscious control over our sensory appreciation. By that, I mean that it's necessary very often to observe from a different perspective and with a different language. That's why the language of kinematics, the language of physics is very interesting, because it can resituate uh, our own movements and present our movements with a different language. It's very useful, and we need to discover that the tendency to, in fact, assume that we feel our movements as they are is totally wrong. If you, in order to exert conscious control over something, you must understand that the something is part of our capacity of conscious control, is within the realm of conscious control. And many people do not understand that our sensory appreciation is within the realm of conscious control until they start to, in fact, well, look at themselves from a different perspective that is offered by video recording. So when Alexander talks about increasing the change of success, remember that he's talking about the change of success of the problem of changing from from wrong to right condition of posture and functioning. So this is quite interesting to think about, and to think that this man can say to us that there is no such thing as the right position, and then develop a whole chapter onto this idea of how to increase or change of success to acquire the right position. In fact, I was stimulated by this man thinking. Instead of telling us there is no such thing as this, there is no such thing as that, is offering us to really start, in fact, discussions with ourselves. So what is it? Is there a right position or not? Is there a correct functioning or not? Are they correct movements, or is everything right? And so we start to have a new look at what Alexander is saying. So, for example, you can begin to be, well, suspicious and more attentive, so that the granularity of what he says becomes more evident. For example, he say that the beginner's attempt to visualize what is done or how to do it is incorrect. Well, suddenly you immediately you will think, okay, he's talking about the beginner's attempt to visualize. In what the beginner's attempt to visualize are different from the expert attempts to visualize. So, because if you think that visualizing is wrong, then you will not even think about it or study what could be visualizing at different levels. So I understand that when the pupil enters his room and start his first long distance lesson with me, his concept of visualizing, his idea of visualizing will be crude. Well, he's going to visualize with his sensory appreciation. He's going to represent to himself what it is he should feel in order to obtain the correct result. And of course, in taking impressions, is relying on his faulty sensory appreciation. So how could visualizing in this way be useful? It is not going to be useful. He's just going to repeat his habits. And repeating a habit is the exact opposite to the executive function, which is adaptability. which is the capacity to adapt to different situations, which is the capacity to switch perspective. I have one perspective and then I can switch quickly to another one. I have one task, I can switch very rapidly to another, or I can start and visualizing different tasks at the same time. Well, of course, I'm going to use language, and language has a tendency to fraction things in different mental objects that are linked in a sequence. So one thing after the other. But it's very possible to use a mental development in which you could think of translating sequences into a simultaneous happening. If you are capable of not entering into action, so in using inhibition, you can say to yourself one order of movement, for example, and postpone the execution and say, no, I inhibit, I don't do anything now. And so you think a second one. So we have a sequence. There is a one after the other, a second one, and you again inhibit the execution. And with memory, you are going to have two movements intention in your mind at the same time. And then you can add a third, a fix. Well, you will have to discover that at first you're very limited in your capacity to organize different intention at the same time. You're limited by your memory. And it's as much verbal memory as spatial memory. You have to have spatial memory in order to imagine four movements happening in the same mechanism at the same time, but it is possible. It's just a question of experiment. And of course, another question of the executive function is to, in fact, continue no matter the result, continue no matter the feeling. The executive function are there to help us instead of being drawn to the most salient fact of the moment. I'm doing something, but then I'm attracted to something else. The executive function and the memory and the extension. There is the extension of the torso, of course, but the extension of the torso cannot happen if the pupil doesn't understand that he must first expand his attention, expand his mind. So we have many tools to expand the mind, and most of them rely on speech. We can inhibit. We can inhibit entering into action in order to maintain in mind one particular intention. There is a difference between the intention and the act. And the intention can be very, very clear when the act is not really, especially if it's a complex one. If it's a complex one, we may have 4 or 5 intention of movements, but it's only when we watch the video that we will discover what has happened exactly. And so we can keep intention. Alexander used to play in front of a mirror, not doing anything. He just wanted to, as he said, rehearse his directions. I think he was involved into visualization, but at a much higher level than trying to feel the actions. If you try and feel the action, it's nearly impossible to inhibit any the movements that are associated with it. And if you, in fact, feel the movement or try to feel how the movement would be done, you're going to feel the movement into one part while all the other parts are going to be acting as always under the command of your sensory appreciation, and you're no further into this path of conscious guidance. So last time, we had a small lesson, Kevin and myself. So I'm going to go back to this because it's very interesting to try and see what could be the interaction between the teacher of conscious guidance and the pupil. So let's go back. And I will share my screen so that you can see 2 moments during a very short procedure. So it all started with Kevin standing. The conditions are already controlled because I made sure that the back of the legs are touching the chair and the chair is blocked by a wall. So we know exactly where the lower part of the organism is situated in space. And that will help us to, in fact, note the position. Well, what is the relative position of the different parts. And there was one order that I wanted Kevin to perform. I said to him, could you please touch the front of the pelvic bone with the index finger of the left hand? And I wanted this to be done with the thumb touching the upper part of the bone of the pelvis, the upper part of the ilium bone. And Kevin complied. And so when the person moves the arms, it's interesting to note the relationship between the movement of the arm and the movement of the torso. And it was seen that during the first attempt, it was clear that the elbow, the tip of the elbow, moved backward in space, and that there was a tendency for the middle torso to move forward in space. This is interesting because then we visualize that there is a tendency of a curvature that is seen at the front and also at the back. Of course, we know things. We know that the arm is connected with the upper torso. This is obvious that if the tip of the elbow is going back in space, there is a large proportion of chance that the shoulder will go back in space. And as the shoulder is really attached with the upper chest and head, there is every chance that if the shoulder goes back, that the upper torso will go back. So we discover that the simple action of placing a finger in space somewhere has consequences upon the mechanism of the torso. There is a tendency to shorten the back just by placing the fingers on the side of the torso. And the experiment I wanted to conduct was to think, okay, if this is a habit, if every time you lift the hand, you lift the elbow, and you lift the shoulder, could there be a different way? Could there be another way where it would be possible to lift the fingers and maybe the palm, but not the elbow? So I started to narrate this story to Kevin. I started to, in fact, have him visualize, but not according to what he felt. I wanted him to start to visualize at different level. I wanted to start him visualize at the level of the coordination of movements. And so we both agreed on the idea that it could be possible to extend the wrist, which means that the finger could go up and that the palm could go down. It's a planning of the movements that is different from the habitual response that is motivated by the order. And in fact, the manner of use is done according to the habitual sensory appreciation of the person. The person has no visualization of anything wrong with lifting the finger in this way, while I do. And I show that this way of using the mechanism of the arm without linking up the movement with the movements of the parts of the torso leads to an increased tendency to shorten the back and unduly lift the upper part of the chest. Therefore, shortening the spine, crowding the Vox box, reducing breathing, everything is there like in a corn that is ready to grow. We want to stop the growing of that coordination. And so suddenly we started to imagine, visualize, or project into the future different movements. We started to say, well, maybe it could be possible to change the behavior and make sure that you do not think the conception of the movement of the elbow as isolated from the movements of the different parts of the torso must be inhibited. We inhibit a conception. We start to, in fact, prepare a new conception, thinking that when I move the elbow, I want at the same time to think of the movement of the different parts of the torso. I know now because I have a new way of visualization. It's a narrated way. I know that the upper part of the arm movement, well, is associated with the elbow movement, but also with the upper part of the torso movement forward in space. So I can anticipate and decide that when the elbow is going to enter into action because I want to touch the front of the pelvis with the fingers, then I will engage a movement of the middle torso against the movement of the upper torso. I want antagonistic actions. We are discussing something. We are visualizing something. It's not yet performed into action. There is no execution yet. We inhibit all form of execution, but we start representing something that does not exist in our sensory appreciation. So it's just a different kind of visualization. And I maintain that this kind of visual representation is absolutely necessary to guide movements. You cannot guide movement. Well, you can guide movements according to what you feel. And if you want to explore something new, you must find a new way of guiding the movements. Yeah, remember that in this whole sequence, we are not discussing moving somebody. There is no question of touching the pupil. The pupil has to perform for himself. And we see on the picture that many things have changed, really, after using visualization in this way. We've seen that, yes, it's somehow possible to reduce the habit of lifting the elbow and the shoulders when the hand is lifted. It's just a start, of course. I see that in this picture, the movement of the shoulder is still slightly upward. It could be interesting to see if the pupil can use the same instruction, exactly the same visualization, but with different performance. It could be possible to measure, well of course, measure first that the back is starting to lengthen. So lengthening in the Alexander terminology is a geometric process. Alexander says it's obviously impossible to lengthen the spine as if pulling onto the actual spine. He says that lengthening is exactly the same process as you would have if you were to measure a piece of paper that is curved and then measure that piece of paper against a straight ruler. You would find that when the paper is straight, when the geometric conditions are that the top and the middle and the bottom of the curve are more or less on the same plane, you can talk about lengthening the lumbar region. So it's absolutely obvious that in 2 seconds, because it required 2 seconds during the performance in order to bring the finger to touch the front of the pelvis. In 2 seconds, it was obvious that there was a new organization of the movements of the part that led to a new resulting position, and that resulting position is much more obviously lengthened than the first. Obviously, because we make a visual control And it's always possible to measure and to measure the distance from the top, the extremities to the wall, and from the middle of the curve to the wall. And we will see that yes, there has been a distinct change in the lengthening of the lumbar region of the torso. So it's a start. It's a very interesting start, and when this happens, the pupil suddenly has an ocular demonstration recorded on screen on his computer that yes, he's been able to in fact command a new coordination of the movements of the parts of the torso. And this is not a concentration in the sense that it's not I am going to organize the parts of the torso and then I'm going to move the hand to touch the front of the pelvis. No, we have of course a focal act which is touch the front of the pelvis with the finger of the left hand, and you have 2 seconds to do that. And while you're doing that, you're going to expand your mind. It's not just the problem of touching the front. The end result is not really interesting. It's the means whereby are the different movement that Kevin commanded, ordered to happen and executed. So this is a 2 second procedure concerning the executive function and the development of this function. Because the main problem I have with research is nowadays on the executive function is that either they talk about children or they talk about adults with difficulties. And so there are many situations where we think that people have lost their mind or have little control over their emotions or have, difficulty resisting impulses. And very often they are in psychiatric hospitals. They should not be. I think they have most of the time. The problem is that we don't know how to teach executive functions to people, and when the teaching is not has not been learn properly, it's necessary to go back and it's necessary to start again. But we need something that is not psychological, that is not like a psychiatric hospital task or a psychology or psychiatry task. We are just discussing just simple movements. We are discussing sitting, standing, placing fingers on different parts of the body. This is, I think, the correct way to start to engage into the conscious control of the mind, which is, in my sense, the real idea of the Alexander technique. So now, observe these images, and you will see that we can use visualization in rather inventive ways, and also ways that have a characteristic that is fundamental, which we call objective. We are not discussing things in the mind as such. How do I feel? How would it feel? Or what would it be like? No, no, no. We are discussing that when we see the first image. So let's change this. These are exactly the same images, and there is a diagram in the middle. So when the first try at placing the fingers is recorded, we see that there is a distinct shortening of the muscle of the upper back. We see that there are muscles at the upper back that are connecting the shoulder blade and the upper arm, and we see that there is an acute angle between the upper arm and the back. Means that in order to perform the action, the pupil has a manner of use that includes a marked narrowing of the upper back. So I can explain to the pupil what it is I see. I will narrate how I saw the first movement happen, Yes, there is an action of the deltoid of the muscle of the upper shoulder, and there is a shortening because why would the shoulder lift toward the head in such a way? There is an explanation. So we are interested in changing the representation of the movement so that the person can check afterwards whether the back has widened or not, the upper back, and the shoulder is part of the upper back as well as the shoulder blade. Yes, we can see that in this condition there is a marked lengthening. Yes, but we could ask also the question, is that all? Is it not possible, you think, to have the elbow even further forward? And when we say further forward, we will say further forward, of course, from the line of the ankle, but also further forward relative to the shoulder blade. And in this way, we are not asking the person to feel the back. We are asking the person to reason with things that can be reasoned. That is, the movement of a bone in space relatively to another bone is something that you can start to model in your mind, visualize at a higher level. The model you have is going to, well, help you discover that, well, of course, if the pupil was in fact pulling the tip of the elbow further forward and the ribs further back, well, it's quite obvious that this muscle would be widening even more. So the pupil would feel more tension. There is no in between the two gestures. There is not one that is correct, the other one is incorrect, and one where you feel very little tension and the one where you're really tense. No, it's the exact opposite in this case. You see that when you lengthen tissues, connective tissues like fascia or ligaments, muscles, tendons, everything is going to lengthen here. And so there is every chance that the pupil will feel this lengthening tension. So there are two kinds of tension. There is a tension that is a shortening tension and a tension that is a lengthening tension. And then we can enter into a very strange discussion where do we like shortening tension or no, we don't? Well, for a simple reason, it's physiologic, is that when the muscle really shortens, the physiology of the muscle is slowed down. So the muscle is going to produce more waste and will have much more difficulty getting the waste out of the muscle. So the muscle will not work very well or very long in that way. It will tire, fatigue will increase very rapidly. While well, yes, we may lack lengthening tension. The muscle gets leaner, the muscle gets more elastic, the muscle and the more elastic means that instead of having a shoulder and a head that are tightly held one relatively to the other, in this case we are starting to have a new relationship between the movement of the head and the movement of the shoulder, because the muscle, it's proved that the more you lengthen the muscle, the more elastic it becomes. So in this case, we can plan a new experiment. We can plan a new experiment expecting this kind of tension. And as we've all been trained with the modern Alexander technique, where tension was the wrong thing, we can start imagining, in fact, producing more movement and not less, because we accept lengthening tensions. We understand that there will be lengthening tension when the torso is going to move in one way and the elbow is moving in an antagonistic direction. The shoulder is going to move in an antagonistic direction. As a result, we have a visualization that yes, these fascia and connective tissue and muscles are going to be stretched even more. Why not? It's interesting just to think, okay, I may be limited in my movement of the elbow by the feeling I incurred while moving the torso and the elbow in opposite direction. Why not why not experiment more? Why not see? Well, we can set a new game and say, well, we want to see the upper part of the arm further forward than the rib cage when the elbow is outward. Well, of course, I do not invent everything. There are things that I've seen. I've seen Alexander sitting with his hands placed on the thighs, and the elbows were much further forward than the ribs, while at the same time the shoulders were very, very low, much lower than this relatively to the chest. So if Alexander was capable of performing these sort of things, why not us? He's done it. Why not me? These were my questions at first when I started to experiment with this. So we start to represent how things function, how things move, how things organize themselves. And so there is another one that is obvious here, is that there is a very little known muscle, very important muscle called the serratus anterior that connects the shoulder blade on one side and the front of the ribs on the other. And when this muscle is released, when it slacks, when it's limp or flaccid, Alexander had many different words for that. Well, you see what happens. The shoulders are very close to the back. There is a narrowing of the back, and the shoulder is very far back. Okay, the elbow is very far back, of course, and there is a tendency, of course, because the muscle is limp, there is no action on the rib cage. There is no lifting and there is no pulling back of the rib cage. In such a case, you get the curve that I was talking about. And if there is a curve at the front, because there are bony ribs that connect the front of the rib cage with the back of the rib cage, well, the action at the front is going to be seen exactly similar at the back, because the vertebrae have no degree of freedom forward or backward relatively to the ribs. So if you have the lower ribs forward, and this is a sign that the serratus anterior lower fascicles are not working, well, that's it. You are arching your back. So there is a relationship between the mechanism of the arm and the mechanism of the ribs, and it's possible to explain to the pupil that yes, why is it that we want the upper part of the arm to move forward, outward, and down? Well, it's because this is linked directly with the mechanism of the torso, and in particular the middle, the protruding abdomen that Alexander is talking so often is suddenly gone, because the person has coordinated the movement of the shoulder blades and the movement of the ribs, in fact, stimulating his mind to have the muscle come back into play instead of the release position that you get while, for example, you could rotate this image and have the person lying down on the back, and you will see the protruding abdomen and the shoulders lying down on the table very flat. Complete misuse of the mechanism of the arm with the mechanism of the torso. This is not the case here. So this is the first part of what I wanted to say about visualization as a process, visualization as something of which you have to be wary about when you start, when you're a beginner, but something you have to, of course, develop. The development of conscious guidance and control, of course, encompasses working memory. This visuospatial memory has to be developed according to reason. You have to understand the mechanism you're working with. You have to start representing the movements you want to perform, and this will help you perform these movements as a coordinated activity. Questions, Kevin?
Yes, there's an interesting relationship between visualization and your own self-speech. So you seem to be, you're narrating a story using words to help the person, help the pupil visualize the moving relationships and the geometry of the parts. So it's not like they're not visualizing a static picture. Instead, they are learning to understand the relationships between the different parts.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Alexander uses a word very, very often. It's the word mechanism. And we want to narrate the movements of the different parts of the mechanisms, because it's the movements that create the posture. It's the movement that create the manner of functioning. So the pupil must have something to start guiding his own movements. Otherwise, he's got to fall back onto his sensory appreciation. He will visualize with his sensory appreciation if you do not give the pupil something else to visualize with. So that's where the work of the teacher is there. At first, I narrate what I see, but very quickly, I want the pupil to understand the process, that when I narrate, the pupil starts to, in fact, use these stories, these theories, if you want, and start to see if with these theories, he can change his coordination of movements. He very quickly will see that, yes, it works. And then I want the pupil to start taking my place, which is narrate himself. At first, the pupil, they say, I don't see what you see. That's why I use so many images, so many drawings that are made above the images, so that when you look at something, you can start discussing. That's what we are going to do next time, discussing what we see. How is it that what we see is not in line with our habitual conceptions? And I want the pupil to start being capable of narrating themselves, because when they start narrating themselves, they start experimenting by themselves. And the change from a wrong to a correct manner of functioning cannot be made in days, and it has to be made by the pupil himself, or if it's a teacher himself. He must suddenly realize that, yes, we are asking him to place a finger on a bone. So we are discussing movements of bones. There are bony structures. We want these bony structures to be moved in different ways when the elbow is moved. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. We absolutely require to change our visualization. We all use visualization to make any sort of movement, scratching your head, sitting down, complex movement like walking. We use visualization, and this visualization does not lead to a proper manner of use. So it's necessary to discover a new way, which is conscious guidance and control. And we are going to use speech in order to narrate, so that the pupil can use speech on his own and narrate exactly what he understands of the mechanism, and test to see whether he can change his performance, his execution, using language. And we are not saying that as soon as you can narrate, you can change the execution and make a perfect execution. It's not exactly that. It's more, we can use narration and then observe how the performance is more in line with the model or not. Not more in line because we feel it is, but more in line because we can start measuring, consciously controlling that it is going in the right direction.
Okay, thank you, Jeando.
You're
We'll leave it
welcome.
here. For people watching the video, if you go underneath, you'll find a link to Jeando where you can begin training your executive functions, since they never did that for you in school. And we'll see you in the next video. Thank you, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye.
Bye-bye.